A melody so perfectly formed arrived in Paul McCartney's sleeping mind that when he reached the piano at dawn and played it back, his first feeling wasn't pride or excitement. It was panic. Every note sat in exactly the right place. The whole thing was already finished, and his immediate conclusion was that he must have stolen it from someone without realizing it. That song was Yesterday. For weeks after it arrived in his sleep, McCartney moved through London asking every musician he trusted the same question. Have you heard this before? Be honest with me. George Martin hadn't. Nobody in the Beatles recognized it. No producer, no session player, no songwriting friend could place a single bar of it. And still McCartney couldn't bring himself to trust what he'd made. He carried that melody around like a wallet found on the street, genuinely waiting for the rightful owner to show up and claim it. Before this ends, you'll understand Yesterday in a way most listeners never do, because what McCartney felt about that song, and what he's admitted across 6 decades of interviews about dozens of others, reveals something true and uncomfortable about the price of genius, and about what it actually means to live inside the most examined catalog in rock music history. Paul McCartney turned 82 in June 2024. At an age when most people of his generation have stopped performing, he still headlines stadiums, still writes, still records, and still carries the complete emotional weight of a body of work that ended before he turned 30. Glastonbury at 79, stadium tours into his 80s. The man continues, and the music continues with him, frozen in amber while he keeps moving forward. What's changed in recent years is his willingness to talk about what that weight actually feels like. Not the mythology of the Beatles, not the curated nostalgia version, but the real account of what went wrong, what he got wrong, what it cost him, and what he still turns over in his mind decades later. McCartney, the singer-songwriter, has always been generous in interviews. But McCartney, the man who carries 60 years of regret, has only recently started speaking with full honesty. For about 30 years, a particular version of the Beatles' story dominated rock criticism, and McCartney has described it plainly as unfair. The narrative went like this. John Lennon was the artist, the one with something to say, the intellectual force behind the band, while McCartney was the crowd pleaser, the tunesmith, the one who wanted everyone to like him. That framing calcified in the music press and stayed calcified long after it stopped being useful. McCartney sat with it, chafed against it, and eventually started pushing back with specifics rather than defensiveness. In interviews with The New Yorker and elsewhere, he pointed to his own avant-garde work, the tape loop experiments on Tomorrow Never Knows, his solo recordings that drew from contemporary classical music, the ways he often pushed the bands toward stranger sonic territory, and asked why none of that fit the story people had decided to tell about him. The answer, as he'd come to understand it, was that the narrative about him was already written before anyone bothered to look closely at the evidence. He put his view of that characterization in a single word: balls. None of that bitterness, though, has kept him from acknowledging where he genuinely went wrong. The Beatles' breakup remains the most documented and least understood rupture in popular music, and McCartney's own role in how it ended is something he's talked around for years before addressing more directly. When his first solo album arrived in April 1970, the press kit contained a self-written question-and-answer session in which he effectively announced his departure from the band. The other 3 found out through newspapers. John Lennon, who had actually been the first to privately decide he was leaving, erupted, furious that McCartney had claimed the public moment for himself. McCartney has acknowledged the chaos of that, admitted the relationships had deteriorated past the point of rational decisions, and described the period after the split as something closer to grief than anger. He retreated to his farm in Scotland, stopped washing, stopped leaving the house, and the world read that as sullenness. What it actually was, as he's since explained, was the loss of the most important creative relationship of his life hitting him all at once. And then, a decade later, John Lennon was murdered. On December 8, 1980, A reporter caught McCartney outside a recording studio moments after he'd been told what had happened. And the words that came out were, "It's a drag." 3 words. The tabloids ran them for years as evidence of coldness, of the complicated feelings between 2 men whose friendship had turned hostile, of something calculated and cruel. McCartney has returned to those words repeatedly in interviews, and each time with the same explanation. He was in complete shock. The words came out entirely wrong, and he walked to his car and wept. None of that nuance made it into the newspapers. What eventually emerged from that grief was a song called Here Today, released in 1982 and structured as a direct conversation with Lennon. The conversation they never got to finish. The apologies that never got made. The argument that simply stopped without resolution. Writing it, McCartney has said, was the only honest response he could manage. The song sits in the McCartney catalog not as a standard tribute, but as something rawer and harder to categorize. One man talking to another who can no longer respond, covering ground they should have covered while there was still time. That's the emotional context worth holding on to when you consider what happened in 2021, when director Peter Jackson released the documentary film Get Back, assembled from 55 hours of footage shot during the January 1969 Let It Be recording sessions. For 50 years, the understanding of those sessions had been shaped by Michael Lindsay Hogg's 1970 film, which presented the band in a state of visible collapse, tense, distant, barely communicating. The Let It Be album carried that funereal mood into homes around the world, and people absorbed it as a document of something ending badly. Get Back showed a different set of facts. The tension was real, including a serious argument between McCartney and guitarist George Harrison that escalated until Harrison walked out of the sessions temporarily. The logistical pressures were real, but running alongside all of that was laughter, genuine musical joy, and moments of chemistry so instinctive between 4 people who'd grown up playing together that the cameras almost seemed intrusive. One of the most striking sequences in the documentary shows McCartney arriving on an ordinary morning and building Get Back from almost nothing in about 20 minutes, working through chord changes and lyric ideas while the cameras rolled and the other musicians gradually joined in. That's not a band in terminal collapse. That's 4 people still capable of making music together, even when everything else was breaking down. McCartney's reaction to seeing that footage, after 50 years of living with the grimmer version of events, landed somewhere between relief and vindication. He admitted that he'd spent decades accepting the bleak narrative, had internalized the image of those sessions as a kind of creative failure, and that watching the actual footage forced a genuine reassessment. He used the word vindication, and the way he said it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, the way you say that word when you've been waiting a long time for something to simply be seen accurately. Now back to that dream. The yesterday story is one McCartney has told many times across many decades, and the details stay consistent. He woke up in his room at the Asher family home on Wimpole Street in London, where he was living with Jane Asher at the time, and the melody was simply present in his head, fully formed. He reached the piano before he was properly awake and played it straight through, then played it again. Certain he was remembering something he'd heard elsewhere, he gave it a placeholder title, Scrambled Eggs, with nonsense lyrics about breakfast, and began the long process of checking. He played it for George Martin. He played it for the other Beatles. He played it for every musician he could get in front of. Nobody recognized it. Nobody could tell him where it came from. And gradually, carefully, then with more confidence, McCartney arrived at the conclusion that the melody had originated with him, that he had, in some genuinely strange way, written a complete song in his sleep and simply retrieved it in the morning. He's spoken since about what that experience taught him regarding creativity, specifically the idea that some work moves through a person rather than from them, and that a songwriter's job sometimes amounts to being conscious at the right moment, reaching the piano before the dream dissolves. Yesterday went on to become, by most measurements, the most covered song in the history of recorded music, and McCartney has described the surreality of that in terms that carry real weight. Watching something that arrived in a dream become a kind of collective property, hearing it in supermarkets and airport lounges, knowing it belongs to everyone now while technically still being his. The circle that closed most recently came through his relationship with Ringo Starr, the only other surviving member of the Beatles. Their collaboration on Now and Then, released in 2023, and assembled partly from a John Lennon demo using modern audio restoration technology, brought George Harrison's guitar parts and Ringo's drums together with McCartney, completing the final track. The bass guitar carrying the harmonic bottom of what became the last Beatles song was McCartney's, played decades after everything else had ended. He said he wept during the recording. He said the whole process felt like completing something he hadn't known was still open. Two men in their 80s, finishing what four young men from Liverpool had started, with the other two present only in recordings. What McCartney's 60-year relationship with this music ultimately describes isn't a story about greatness living comfortably with itself. He worried yesterday was plagiarized. He mismanaged the breakup in ways he's admitted plainly. He said the wrong 3 words outside a recording studio on the worst night of his life. He spent 3 decades accepting a characterization of himself that left out half the truth. Creative courage, as McCartney has actually lived it, turns out to look less like confidence and more like continuing despite all of the above. Releasing the work before you fully understand it, being wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and unable to tell which is which until years later. The melody arrived in a dream. He feared it belonged to someone else. That fear, as it turned out, was wrong. And he wrote it down anyway, which is the only part of the story that actually matters.